There were 4 different classes of blacks in Philadelphia as classified by Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois. But how did they think? How did they live? And how did they spend their money in ways that made them different from one another? Let's touch on this in his 1899 book titled The Philadelphia Negro. In good times, perhaps 50% of the Negroes could well be designated comfortable, but in time of financial stress, vast numbers of this class fall below the line into the poor and go to swell the number of paupers, and in many cases of criminals. He estimates that 50% of Negroes lived comfortable when the times were good. But what is comfortable? It means a stable job, enough to eat, and a decent place to stay. But it's a vulnerable position because when the economy is slow, these folks fall into the poor, extremely poor, and in many cases, the criminal classes. Indeed, this whole division into incomes of different classes is, among the Negroes, much less stable than among the whites, just as it used to be less stable among the whites of 50 years ago than it is among those of today. The whole division into poor, comfortable, and well-to-do depends primarily on the standard of living among a people. Let us, therefore, note something of the income and expenditure of certain families in different grades. The very poor and semi-criminal class are congregated in the slums at 7th and Lombard Streets, 17th and Lombard, and 18th and Naudain, together with other small back streets scattered over the ward. They live in 1- and 2-room tenements, scantily furnished and poorly lighted and heated. They get casual labor and the women do washing. The children go to school irregularly or loaf on the streets. So the very poor and semi-criminal class Negroes shared these in common. They struggled with work, they lived in poor conditions, and their children would skip school and hang out in the streets. This class does not frequent the large Negro churches, but part of them fill the small, noisy missions. They didn't go to churches where most of the other Negroes went. But some of them went to these small churches filled with a lot of noise, probably from hollering preachers and shouting members. The vicious and criminal portion do not usually go to church. They usually skip church altogether. They were too busy caught up in crime. Now, did you notice how he made a distinction between the semi-criminal and the vicious and criminal? The semi-criminal would be people who were on the edge. They may have occasionally committed crimes or done the crimes out of desperation, but they were not completely immersed in criminal activity. The vicious and criminal portion were the full-time criminals who had made the lower realms their home. Those of this class who are poor but decent are next-door neighbors, usually to pronounced criminals and prostitutes, and that was an unfortunate situation that still exists for many blacks today. Some of them are good people, but they lack the skills to make enough money to leave. And many times, when they have kids, they lack the parenting ability to keep the kids away from the criminal elements, which seek to recruit their children because they're coming for them, right? Especially in the inner city black neighborhoods throughout the major cities in America. They're coming for them. It's not a joke. The criminal elements have over time been allowed to multiply. And many of the children of decent poor people continue to supply the criminal ranks, right? That's why my wife's parents had to eventually get out of Philadelphia. When I spoke with her father, he told me that once his son got into the 9th grade, he could see that trouble was potentially pulling at him. They had already moved from the rugged West Philadelphia area and relocated over into Germantown. But that wasn't enough. So they eventually had to move out of the city altogether to start fresh, right? And they were poor. But my wife has a very good set of parents who think, plan, and prioritize, and they are very proactive and intentional. So being poor wasn't going to stop them from doing what they believed was best for their children, because living so close to the criminal class was not it for them. The income and expenditure of some of these families follow. Family number 1 lives in one of the worst streets of the ward, surrounded by thieves and prostitutes. There are 3 persons in the family, a woman of 34 with a son of 16 and a second husband of 26. Both the husband and son are out of work. the former being a waiter and the latter a bootblack. They live in one filthy room, 12 feet by 14, scantily furnished and poorly ventilated. The woman works at service and receives about $3 a week. They pay $12 a month for 3 rooms, and sub-rent 2 of them to other families, which makes their rent about $3. Their food costs them about $1 a week, and the fuel 56 cents a week during the winter. Their expenditure for other items is varying and indefinite. Beer, however, comes in for something. Their whole expenditure is probably $125 to $150 a year, of which the woman earns at least $100. So this family was very poor. Their living conditions were poor. The woman paid most of the bills, and somehow they were still able to manage to buy beer, right? Think about that. Family number 2 has a yearly budget as follows for 2 persons. That's this right here. Rent $48 per year, food $74.88 per year, fuel $16.60 per year. Other items would bring this up to about $150 to $175. Family number 3, consisting of 1 person, reports the following budget, not including rent: food $30, fuel $15, clothing $10, amusement $1.50, sickness $10, and other purposes $15, for a total of $81.50 per year. Then, when the rent is added, which Dr. Du Bois says is no higher than about $40, they have a total yearly expenditure of $121.50. Family number 4, 4 persons, man and wife and 2 babies, living in 1 room, spend as follows: rent $36, food $69.16, and $18 for fuel, for a yearly total of $123.16. The man has worked 1½ weeks in the month as a wire fence maker, when regularly employed, which is about half the time. The rest of the time he takes care of the babies while his wife works at service. The last 2 families seem respectable but unfortunate. Families 3 and 4 have a good head on their shoulders, but they are weighed down by circumstances which are too difficult to control. The other 2 are doubtful. Families 1 and 2 are of questionable character. They may not be very trustworthy, so a watchful eye has to be kept on them. The poor are a degree above these cases. We just finished the extremely poor, and now we're moving into the poor, which are just a few steps above them on the ladder. They are composed of the inefficient, unfortunate, and improvident, the people who aren't productive, are set back due to circumstances, and don't plan for the future, and just manage to get enough to eat, a little to wear, and shelter. They're just surviving. They're doing better than the extremely poor, but not enough to feel any sense of a real comfort. A specimen family is composed of 6 persons, man and wife, a widowed daughter, 2 grandsons of 13 and 11, and a nephew of 28. They live in 3 rooms, with poor furniture and of fair cleanliness. The father and nephew are laborers, often out of work. The mother does day's work and the daughter is at service. This is an honest family belonging to one of the large Baptist churches. Their cost of living is about $275 a year. They are poor and of good character, just like many poor people are. We next come to the great hard-working laboring class, the 47% of the population which is, on the whole, most truly representative of the mass. Pay attention. They live in houses with 3 to 6 rooms, nearly always well furnished. They spend considerable for food and dress and for churches and beneficial societies. They have some extra money to spend, and a lot of it goes towards food, clothing, church, and other beneficial societies. They are honest and good-natured for the most part, but are not used to large responsibility, because some of them weren't good-natured. Just because someone has money doesn't automatically mean they have good character. There are plenty of people who have some extra money and work hard and have much worse character than poor people. Right? Having money and having character are 2 distinct categories. But in this instance, most of the Negroes with some extra money were good-natured. But their issue was that they weren't responsible people, according to Dr. Du Bois. Responsibility is also a distinct category, because it's one skill to know how to make some extra money, but it's a separate skill to know how to manage it responsibly. There are 4 adults and 3 children in this family number 12. Total expenditure, exclusive of rent, $805. This is not the hard-working laboring class we just went over. This family is part of one of the well-to-do families. This is one of the best families in the city. They keep 1 servant. One of the best families means they are of good character, the household is in order, they are economically prosperous, and are responsible. They are considered well-rounded for their circumstance. There are 3 adults and 2 children in the family. The class to which these last families belong is often lost sight of in discussing the Negro. This group of Negroes is often ignored and overlooked, and that's by both the blacks and the whites. This small group is like an outcast in that community, and all the attention is paid mostly to the criminal and laboring classes. It is the germ of a great middle class, meaning these people could potentially grow into a powerful middle class. They are the image of what a Negro middle class could be if their image were allowed to multiply. But in general, its members are curiously hampered by the fact that, being shut off from the world about them, they are the aristocracy of their own people, with all the responsibilities of an aristocracy, and yet they, on the one hand, are not prepared for this role, and their own masses are not used to looking to them for leadership. The issue is that the whites don't want them in their society, and the blacks don't look at them as leaders. In addition, they're responsible for themselves, but they lack the training, confidence, and the experience to lead the masses of the blacks. As a class, they feel strongly the centrifugal forces of class repulsion among their own people, and indeed, are compelled to feel it in sheer self-defense. They feel themselves pulling away from the other classes of blacks, who are seen by society in a negative light. So this pulling away helps defend their reputation and protect themselves from being grouped with the stigmatized masses. So we can see here some early urges to break free from the typical Negro reputation. But in these earlier periods, there was really nowhere for them to escape, right? They continued to share the same status because the time was not ripe for the division. They do not relish being mistaken for servants. They don't like people thinking of them as butlers, maids, and janitors. Those were more akin to slave roles and the lower status, and they didn't see themselves as that. They shrink from the free and easy worship of most of the Negro churches. The easy worship is what most of the blacks learned during slavery. The elementary doctrines of Christianity mixed with the screaming, hollering, and the dancing, and the clapping of hands. So this class of blacks didn't want to be tied to that, and they shrink from all such display and publicity as will expose them to the veiled insult and depreciation which the masses suffer. They didn't act or behave in ways that resembled the typical Negro, right? They didn't want to be disrespected and looked down upon like the masses of the blacks were. Consequently, this class, which ought to lead, refuses to head any race movements on the plea that they draw the very color line against which they protest. They didn't want anything to do with leading the black movement, because if they did, then it would expose them to some of the same racial prejudices that they were trying to avoid. As soon as they would have tried to lead anything like that, then they would have been lumped in there with the rest of the blacks and insulted and degraded, which they were trying to avoid. On the other hand, their ability to stand apart, refusing on the one hand all responsibility for the masses of the Negroes, and on the other hand seeking no recognition from the outside world, which is not willingly accorded, their opportunity to take such a stand is hindered by their small economic resources. They didn't have enough money to really go off and do their own thing. He says this group wasn't looking to lead the masses, nor were they chasing white approval, but they were hindered from becoming independent due to limited finances, right? So the time just wasn't right. Even more than the rest of the race, they feel the difficulty of getting on in the world by reason of their small opportunities for remunerative and respectable work. On the other hand, their position as the richest of their race, though their riches is insignificant compared with their white neighbors, makes unusual social demands upon them. A white Philadelphian with $1,500 a year can call himself poor and live simply. A Negro with $1,500 a year ranks with the richest of his race, and must usually spend more in proportion than his white neighbor in rent, dress, and entertainment. They had the pressure of needing to look the part. They made the most money out of the blacks, but what they made was small in comparison to the moneymakers in the white community. And they felt compelled to try to act and look as if they had more than they really did. This is similar to what Dr. E. Franklin Frazier talks about in The Black Bourgeoisie when he studied the black middle class in the 1950s. Spending too much money on insignificant things to make themselves appear as something that they're really not. See, this was a psychological hurdle that needed to be purged, which is one of the reasons they weren't able to separate at that time to become independent. In every class thus reviewed, there comes to the front a central problem of expenditure. Probably few poor nations waste more money by thoughtless and unreasonable expenditure than the American Negro, and especially those living in large cities like Philadelphia. The slave master talked about this during slavery, and the whites talked about it after emancipation. Now we see Dr. Du Bois chiming in on it with the same evaluation. The spending habits and priorities of the Negro consciousness have been a major hindrance from making progress in the free world. First, they waste much money in poor food and in unhealthful methods of cooking. The meat bill of the average Negro family would surprise a French or German peasant or even an Englishman. The crowds that line Lombard Street on Sundays are dressed far beyond their means. Much money is wasted in extravagantly furnished parlors, dining rooms, guest chambers, and other visible parts of the homes. Again, just trying to appear on the surface like it's all good. Too much focus on superficiality. Thousands of dollars are annually wasted in excessive rents, in doubtful societies of all kinds and descriptions, in amusements of various kinds, and in miscellaneous ornaments and gewgaws. All this is a natural heritage of a slave system. That's where it's coming from. Generations of passing on habits and ways of interacting with the world that are not the most effective ways to navigate the free society. But it is not the less a matter of serious import to a people in such economic stress as Negroes now are, meaning every dollar matters, and having bad financial habits have real-world consequences, especially with Negroes being in such a stressful economic position. This is what he's talking about. The Negro has much to learn of the Jew and Italian as to living within his means and saving every penny from excessive and wasteful expenditures. That's some good advice. The Jews in Brooklyn are masters when it comes to money. Some of their neighborhoods, like Borough Park, have high poverty rates, some of the highest in the city. Yet they still find a way to fund organizations within that community to meet most of its basic needs. But they have a group of people who are all on the same frequency and share culture that promotes that type of spending to achieve those types of goals. Right? They built up the energy to work for them going in that direction. You see? It's never going to work when you have only fragments of a group who think like that, and then the rest of the group just doesn't care and does whatever they want to do. Right? So there is much to learn from people who are highly skilled in this area, and that's just what it is. So from here, what we're going to do is stop, and we're going to pick up in the next commentary. I thank you for your time. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.